was asked to speak about lay movements in Europe and the United States. In order to do that, I have to begin with three brief caveats. One is, I'm not a theologian or a philosopher, and I'm not even a historian who can talk about it with the erudition that we just heard of the last. I'm a legal scholar, so what am I doing talking about these things? It's far out of my area of expertise, but that means by implication that I will necessarily be speaking primarily from experience, from personal experience of my involvement in a movement. In my case, it's the movement of communion and liberation founded by Luigi Giussani. But also my observation, interaction with people from a variety of different movements over the years. I've had a lot of occasion to work with them and across them, and I'll try to generalize beyond just CL to these other experiences as well. The second caveat is this. All day long, so far today, all day yesterday, we've been using the term lay movement. I use in my title the word ecclesial movement, and I think it's important to recognize that these are movements that aren't just of lay people. They're not movements that are just for lay people. All of the major movements that we're talking about in very interesting and fruitful ways bring together lay people with the ordained, with religious, into new forms of community and new forms of relationship. So they are lay and commonly referred to as lay in the sense that all of the ones we're talking about have a predominance of lay people, and in important ways have lay people within it in positions of authority and leadership and initiative in ways that are distinctive and central, but precisely by virtue of the fact that they combine different forms of life in the church is part of what is new and interesting and important about them at this moment in history, I think. And third, lastly, I'm speaking about movements in a very generic sense. Some of what I'm going to be referring to as movements don't describe themselves as movements in the church, because movements can have, for example, a juridical meaning to it, right? Opus Dei is not a movement juridically because it's a personal prelature. In the more generic sense in which I'm trying to refer to it in a phenomenological sense, I think of Opus Dei as a movement as well. The neo-catechumenal way resists calling itself a movement, but I think in the terms that I'm describing it in a very generic sense, it's a movement as well. Okay? In this sense, it's not unlike, as we already heard, the movements that have been present since the beginning of the church, always, since the church itself as a movement, or monasticism as a movement, or the rise of the mendicant orders, so relevant to us, our community here, as movements in their time. So what does the landscape of these movements look like today in Europe and the United States in particular? Well, first of all, there are many of them. There are a lot of them. Some are extremely small and local. They're single communities of families living and working together in an intentional way. Others claim as many as 120 million lives touched worldwide. That's from Catholic Charismatic Renewal. Some of the better known ones in the United States, in Europe, in terms of size or visibility and presence, are Catholic Charismatic Renewal, Communion and Liberation, Couples for Christ, Crucio, Christian Life Movement, you see, I'm only in the C's alphabetically, okay? This goes on, Focolare, L'Arche, Militia of the Immacolata, Neo-Catechumenal Way, Sant'Egidio, Schoenstatt, and others. So at first glance, it would seem that the only commonality of these is that they're so different from one another, paradoxically, right? And in fact, that's one of the first things that John Paul II himself observes when talking about the movements in Christi Fidelis Laity. They're so different from one another. They differ in size from a few thousand or even a few hundred or tens to millions. Many don't have a formal membership as such, so it's very hard to count them. The structure and organization is highly variable, from highly structured, the Militia of the Immacolata or Opus Dei, to very loose associations without any clear organizational form that we can identify. Their apostolic work is extremely diverse. Many focus on marriage and family life or on education, some on peace and reconciliation, on interreligious dialogue, on accompaniment of the disabled, and so on. So at the root, really, their difference springs from very, very different charisms, as much so as the variety of religious orders that have been present in the history of the church. We all know, dozens of jokes about the Dominican and the Franciscan and the Jesuit who walk into the bar together, right? And that's all playing on the differences of charisms. Well, exactly the same is true with the ecclesial movements. My late great friend, who I will cite again later at the end of my talk, the theologian Lorenzo Albacete, whenever he was part of Community Liberation, whenever he was asked, so is your movement kind of like Opus Dei? And he would respond with a wry grin. He'd said, oh yeah, Community Liberation, it's like Opus Dei for bad Catholics. So, notwithstanding this diversity, they do have things in common that might allow us to discern a larger pattern within the reality of the church today at a very general level. What is their role in the church collectively? And on these questions of the laity that we've been discussing here yesterday and today, and especially for the United States and Europe. A different way of asking that question is to ask, what is the human need that they're appealing to? What is their attractiveness to those who find themselves belonging to these associations and movements? One can analogize again the emergence of other movements in the history of the church to this. They are responding always to the presence of a specific human need in time. Some of the great movements that have been born and continue represent the Spirit responding to these concrete contexts and realities. Monasticism emerging in response to the particular historical realities of its time. St. Dominic giving birth to a new kind of order that brought the formation and systematic learning of those monastic orders to bear on the problems and needs of cities and of lay people in his time, with a more flexible and differently organized form than the secular clergy could do, with a need for preaching in vernacular, but with a spirituality that was contemplative as well, and in study and in prayer. So in all of I guess what I'm getting at is one way of getting at the character and the role of ecclesial movements is indirectly by approaching the question, not directly, but by first assessing some of the signs and needs of women and men in the world today, especially in the context of Europe and North America and the post-Christian societies that we find ourselves in. So from this is sort of the hypothesis of the rest of my remarks. I think it's fair to see the new ecclesial movements as representing a response or an alternative, or perhaps an antidote would be the best analogy, if you will, to some of the most challenging aspects and characteristics of the contemporary environment in which we live. So let me turn then for a few moments to some of those distinctive features that I think are salient, that we need urgently a response to in our environments. I'll mention 5 of them. We could mention any number of them, assessing it. And I won't go into detail because time, first of all, but we're all familiar with the variety of cultural critics of modernity, from any of the recent popes of the last few generations, and more to theorists and critics, from academics to popular authors. So I think we'll all recognize some of the things I'm going to identify, even if I do so only briefly. So of these 5 things, the first one I'll say is we live in an era of very strong, in fact, extreme forms of individualism. Okay? There have been various references already in the remarks made yesterday to the atomization and subjectivity of contemporary life. Everything is about preference and choice, individual preference and choice, and the consumer mentality that comes with it. Everything is about I. The paradox, of course, is that in this individualism, in a certain sense, the I doesn't even exist as a subject, right? As is well diagnosed by others, the individual human person has never been in a more precarious state, arguably. Besieged. Young people don't know who they are, why they're here, what their lives are oriented towards. And so the excessive individualism becomes for them, I see this in my children, a tyranny of relativism or alienation that finds no distraction, that only seeks distraction from the nothingness around it in alcohol and pot, porn and PlayStations, and the superficiality of everyday life for them. It's an individualism without a subject or a protagonist. The second thing is the lack of community. Now, these are all directly related one to another, right? We see every day and hear about the effects of the dissolution of community life and fragmentation. There are no more families, neighborhoods, forms of civic engagement disappear with them. And with that emerge deeper forms of inequality and division in our communities. We see it every day around us. And this is all at the same time that there's a sharp increase in pluralism in our societies at a social level and diversity from the fact of migration in particular these days. But we're facing challenges of social cohesion, integration, and unity above all. The third is an exaltation in our era of the value of freedom. This is something about which Pope Benedict spoke so eloquently, so often, right? But as he pointed out, it's an exaltation of freedom coupled with a deep confusion and division over the meaning of authentic human freedom. Individual choice and autonomy are given pride of place exclusively, and at the cost of having very little understanding of the idea of freedom as a capacity to choose the good, or freedom as being realized in relationship with others, a freedom that comes from love with the implied need and dependence of relationality. It's quite different from the freedom to consume. Fourth, we have witnessed, and there was a reference to this yesterday as well, to a reduction in the meaning of work, human labor, and with it, our relationship to material things in the material world, the ends. Our students, as Anna was describing so beautifully yesterday, are concerned with a success in the world that really doesn't give them any sense of what their labor is actually oriented towards and what it's for, how it relates to money, to goods, to the idea that the created order is something given to us, and therefore we ought to be concerned with things like the degradation of the planet and the environment that it brings about. Fifth and finally, and again, all of these, I know I'm compressing so much, forgive me, but the fifth one that I want to mention is simply the reduction or perhaps even eclipse of the idea of the human and what it means to be human. It's a rejection of the idea of human self-limitation and a replacement of that with an idea of the human as essentially plastic, as essentially reformable however we wish. That eliminates implicitly all of the big questions of life. Again, I see it poignantly in my students all the time. Why am I here? What is my life for? What do I truly desire? Why is the latest iPhone not bringing me the happiness that I thought it would? I mean, we laugh, but it's really very sad because it's so present, and that's not an exaggeration, right? This is also where sort of the absence of the attention to beauty in life comes in. That a couple of people, but Greg Wolfe in particular, were emphasizing yesterday. Now, we could identify more characteristics, and we could also see, I think, that there's sort of artificially, for descriptive purposes, naming 5, all of them hang together in sort of a coherent pathology of modern life. We can see the way that they actually hang together through things like the way that technology inflects all of them, right? And the technocratic frame of mind exacerbates loneliness and alienation, a lack of human connection and community, an increase in materialism and consumption and so forth, loss of meaning in work. Or similarly, how many of these things are tied together by a quite distorted understanding of eros and human sexuality. It contributes to individualism, to a loss of the sense of human, to a confusion over the meaning of freedom and so forth. Now, my point is not to engage in a deep diagnosis of contemporary modern society, of the prevailing culture, or anti-culture, as my friend and colleague Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame calls it. But really simply to acknowledge that there is this prevailing environment that deeply affects the capacity and the desire and the need for all people to engage the church. And at the same time, it puts into stark evidence our need for God. Not just any God, but a God who has become man, who persists in history today through the presence of the church, who accompanies them, us, in the concreteness of our daily lives. From there, I think we can begin to see that amid all the diversity of charisms and apostolates and organizational structures and juridical status, how much the ecclesial movements that have been born, especially in the 20th century, but also older ones, offer certain kinds of responses to these pathologies, and do so in ways that aren't simply nostalgic recollections of a past that can't be retrieved, but rather in new ways, ways that aim to capture what is good as well. Again, the example of St. Dominic is quite salient. Okay? Let me give you a few examples briefly that correspond to these 5 sort of dimensions of modern life that I've already mentioned. One, I talked about the value and place of the individual. Well, for the movements and many people who belong to the movements, this form, this is a particular way that Christ has reached me, my life, in all its specificity and concretely. He's calling me to bring him into my work and to participate in his life, and this is the form of my belonging to the church. And so it becomes, in a sense, a very individualized and personal encounter rather than a Christian discourse. And this has the appeal of a certain kind of authenticity for the individual in an age where individual authenticity is the currency of the realm. Movements offer very different styles of prayer, of living in community, of working. Even the language that they use becomes distinctive in their vocabularies sometimes. So in movements, we people have a name, not the anonymity that it often pervades, for example, parish life. This is especially true for young people. In Communion and Liberation, there's a very strong emphasis on the I as a subject of an encounter with Christ. But you see that throughout many of the other movements. Schoenstatt, for example, places special emphasis on respecting the originality of each one of its members. And I could go through many other examples. I'll just have to pick and choose a few of them in the interest of time. The second aspect I mentioned was the dissolution of communal life. And here perhaps is the most central of the characteristics of the new movements. They are new forms of communion, all of them. Catholic charismatic renewal emphasizes the building of community. Communion and Liberation emphasize the sacrament of friendship and companionship. Focolare has centrally the charism of unity, pervading everything that it does. Also with a great sensitivity to things like the presence and relationship to different religions, to diversity in society, to the role and presence of women in society. Neo-catechumenal way generates distinctive communities of families living together. We can go through even more. It's also worth highlighting under this category that in both Europe and the United States, movements often have a very strong relationship to communities of immigrants. 2 minutes. All right. Or a few more. It won't be too much more. I promise. The third point was the problem of freedom. Again, Communion and Liberation focuses from its very name on authentic liberation, which comes from communion with the body of Christ. Couples for Christ, to just choose one other example, aims at pursuing what it calls, with capital letters, total Christian liberation. But how do they do so? Explicitly through a life of love and service, not through the affirmation of individual autonomy. Fourth, work and material things, economic life, the care for creation comes alive in these communities. Again, inscribed into the very name of it, you find it in Opus Dei, the sanctification of ordinary work. I hope we'll hear more about Focolare's work on economics and the economy of communion, which so transforms the nature of our relationship to work and material things. Many initiatives throughout these movements pervade the world of business and economics, and so forth. And then fifthly, the affirmation of the human as an objective referent, as something of substance, as a protagonist in the world. Here, perhaps, is where my own experience of belonging to Communion and Liberation comes most to the fore, because although it's present throughout, I think, many and perhaps all of the movements, this distinctive kind of anthropology, in CL, Father Giussani has emphasized it with a peculiar form of emphasis and centrality. Okay. Now, let me be moving to the close. Okay. Let me note that in all of these ways that I think movements help to respond to the pathologies of our age, they also correspond to ways in which the structures and forms of the church in the modern era have otherwise struggled to respond to the challenges of the age, right? In adequate ways. Right? Parishes have found themselves, mostly incapable of responding to these challenges. Some have, undoubtedly, but whether it's limitations of geography, human mobility, the fragmentation of community ties, the rise of pluralism, that differs from, the Italian-American parish that my parents first arrived in, right? And its kind of cohesiveness. The problem of anonymity, the lack of intentionality in parishes, all hamper these responses. I also want to emphasize, though, by contrast, this in no way is meant to imply that movements are the only answer, nor that movements don't often pose their own challenges and problems, nor that parishes are irrelevant, or that they're in opposition to movements. In fact, in my experience throughout the United States and Europe, I've very frequently observed that when I encounter unexpectedly a very vibrant, alive parish that has families of all ages and lots of activity, it's not uncommon that rooted in that parish is one or another of the ecclesial movements that's giving it life. The movements bring life into the parishes. They're not opposed to them when they're doing their job. It's important that to do their job, they have to meet the criteria of ecclesiality that John Paul II describes in Christi Fidelis Laity. But when they do, as John Paul II said, they are, in an important way, co-essential to the institutional aspects of the church. This is what he said about the movements. I've often had occasion to stress that there's no conflict or opposition in the church between the institutional dimension and the charismatic dimension, of which movements are a significant expression. Both are co-essential to the divine constitution of the church founded by Jesus, because they both help to make the mystery of Christ and his saving work present in the world. So seen in this light, from the perspective of what they're responding to in terms of human needs, I think movements are a powerful manifestation of the Spirit's regenerating the presence and maturity and agency of lay people in the church today. They're an important counterweight from that point of view to the narrative of crisis and decline that we hear so often. Just to give one final example in order to close. Last year, Rod Dreher came to Notre Dame to present his book on the Benedict option. And I asked him at the time, Rod, how come in all of this work you never talk about any of the lay movements? I mean, they would seem to be exactly the incarnation of what you're desiring in an important sense. And he gave an answer that I don't think was a very good answer. He appealed to the fact that, he was pressured for time and his publisher wanted to go to press, so he didn't have time to do everything. But I think there's a deeper reason. I think the deeper reason is it contradicts the narrative of decline in the church. Right? Because when you look at the lay movements, you see fertility, you see generativeness, you see newness, you see new life. So instead of the Benedict option, I'll close again with my friend Monsignor Albacete, who said at one point, and I think this is really even more relevant than when he said it in 2002. He said, if in addition to all the terrible things we have learned, speaking of 2002, if tomorrow it was revealed that the Pope had a harem, that all the cardinals had made money on Enron stock and were involved in internet porno, then the situation of the church today would be similar to the situation of the church in the late 12th century when Francis of Assisi first kissed a leper.